Hey everybody, Pastor Tim here, and welcome back to our continuing study on this book right here, Does God Want Us to Be Happy by Randy Alcorn. We're going to be in chapter 7 this week. I want to let you know that next week it's going to be chapter 8 and 9, so 2 chapters for next week, and that'll keep us on pace to wrap up by the end of the summer. Couple things I want to just mention to you real quick is that I'd love it if you would leave any comments or feedback that you have. Leave them in the comment section either on YouTube or on Facebook. Just overall thoughts and impressions of the book. What have you learned? What have you liked? Maybe what's been challenging? As I've said before, there's some conversations I've had with folks that they're kind of asking questions in a really good way as they wrestle through and think about these various topics of happiness and God and Jesus and humor with Jesus. So I'd love to hear those thoughts and comments if you could leave those in the comment section right now, just as we're starting, whether on Facebook or on YouTube. So we're in chapter 7, and the topic this week is, where does true happiness begin? I underlined this quote. I love it. He starts off by saying, human history is the story of our desperate search for true and lasting happiness. I think that's so interesting because I was reflecting on that topic in relation to a ministry that has been influential for me at various seasons in my life, Desiring God. And the tagline for Desiring God is, God is most glorified in us when we are most satisfied in Him, right? And so when you read through the scripture, you see the idea that God desires and will be ultimately glorified. And so we can look at that and say, okay, well, that's in contrast to my happiness. But actually, when we find our happiness in God, He's most glorified. He's most honored when we find our true happiness in Him, right? And so similarly, humans, whether you're a believer or not a believer, you're looking for happiness. We're just wired to be that way. That's one of those existential realities of living on this planet, is that being human drives us toward happiness. And so where will we find true happiness is the ultimate question, right? Now, it can be easy at that point to say happiness is found in God, period. But that sometimes just presses the issue a little bit deeper and say, okay, well, what do you mean by that? So I'm just going to stare at God forever, and that's where I'm going to find my happiness. It's interesting when you go back to the book of Genesis that the image given in Genesis 3, where we hear about the fall, is that God shows up, and the language that's used is in the cool of the day, kind of in the afternoon or evening, right? It's not as if God is not present in any way, shape, or form prior to those evening walks, let's say. But Adam and Eve are still active in their being fruitful, in their multiplying, in their cultivating the earth, and what's called the cultural mandate in Genesis 1 and 2. So there is a way in which we have Adam and Eve had perfect contentment and happiness as it was intended to be in the Garden of Eden, without the sense of just kind of sitting there and staring at God and saying, wow, He's wonderful, wow, He's wonderful, wow, He's wonderful. It's not robotic like that, right? And so in the same way, when we say true happiness is found in God, it's not just, well, I'm just singing worship songs 24/7 and looking at Him or looking at His presence in heaven. That's not what true happiness is, biblically speaking. It's much more multifaceted. It's really under the umbrella of the holiness and the joy and the goodness of God. We exist with a constant, in heaven we'll have a constant awareness of His love and goodness and grace while we actually do other things. Those will not be in contrast with one another. In some sense, we'll be able to perfectly multitask in heaven, to at the same time be in the full understanding that we're in the presence of God and be in conversation with one another, celebrate with one another. So, when we answer the question, where does true happiness begin or where is true happiness found, just to say in God, we need to flesh it out and say, okay, what do we mean by that? And that's really what happens in this chapter. Basically, I think if we were to summarize the content here in this chapter, it would say true happiness is found under the reign of God and in relationship with God. He gives this quote from George Whitefield where he says, Whitefield wrote, I drank of God's pleasure as out of a river. Oh, that all were made partakers of this living water. And so Whitefield's point is to say, like, I've experienced God and now there's fullness of joy in it. But it's not fullness of joy, again, just staring at God or just saying the word God, 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 God over in your head. It's as he walks out his life, as an evangelist, as a preacher, Whitefield was, he experienced God's goodness and grace in that. So, Randy Alcorn turns and basically talks about the idea of how many people pursue happiness in the wrong places. Excuse me again, I got a little cough here. He talks about how people look for happiness all over the place, and they find it in things that give happiness for a moment, and then that happiness fades away. He talks about eating chocolate-covered cyanide or chocolate-covered poison, right? It tastes good for a second, but ultimately it's just going to kill us. It's not going to bring us true happiness. We see that throughout the scriptures, that Jesus calls people to a deeper, more profound level of contentment, happiness, and salvation ultimately. Think about the woman at the well, where he says, you're looking for this water that's going to basically satisfy your body for a little while. I can give you living water that will overflow into rivers of life. And she's like, I want that type of water. That's the water I'm pursuing. She knows she wants deep happiness, not just temporary happiness, which she was pursuing to some degree just to survive with the water, but in a greater sense in her life, it was the pursuit of happiness in relationships, and it wasn't working for her. So, Randy Alcorn on page 74 talks about the idea of that song, turn your eyes upon Jesus, look full in his wonderful face, and the things of earth will go strangely dim in the light of his glory and grace. Alcorn basically pushes back on that and says, excuse me again, the greatest sense, the fullness of us experiencing the goodness of God is when we can experience the blessings on earth and realize that they come from God, right? We talked about this the first week in my sermon I did in the book of Acts to say that true celebration doesn't just end here, it goes this way too. The most full form of celebration is horizontal as we celebrate with other humans, and then vertical as we see that God is the true source of all good gifts. He says on page 75, finding our greatest pleasure in God elevates our enjoyment to those happiness-giving things. Let me read it again. Finding our greatest pleasure in God elevates our enjoyment of those happiness-giving things. At the end of the chapter, he's going to talk about the idea that Eric Liddell was running, and he had pleasure in the process of running, and that wasn't in contrast to his joy in being a missionary. Both those things could give him a legitimate sense of joy and pleasure and happiness, and they were all gifts from God. Now, the main thing I want to focus on here is really kind of page 75 into 76, where Randy Alcorn goes back to the scripture and looks at Paul in Acts 14, and Paul does some of the same thing in Acts 17, where he notes that Paul is calling us to invite people into true happiness. Listen to the language of Paul. Paul said that God has blessed you by giving you rain from above as well as seasonal harvests and satisfying you with food and happiness. And then he says, we are bringing you good news, telling you to turn from these worthless things to the living God who made the heavens and the earth and the sea and everything in them. Part of our call, and he digs into this, talking about his relationship or this conversation he has with this young man who comes to ask him questions. Paul is calling us to invite people into happiness, but he's calling us to invite people into true happiness. To realize that, yes, God's given you gifts and blessings in your happiness that you're experiencing today, but there's something even greater that he's offering to you. There's something even more profound that he's offering to you, and that is the profoundness of salvation, ultimate eternal happiness that reshapes how we think about this temporal happiness. And so I just want to ask you that question and get you thinking about this. When you think about inviting people into Christianity, do you think about inviting them into happiness? Do you think about inviting them into joy and peace and pleasure and goodness and happiness, or do you inviting them into just deal with your sin? Because it's not either or, it's both and. Yes, we have to deal with our sin, and in dealing with our sin, it points us to true and eternal happiness, true and full happiness in the end of all things. He notes that David Murray writes this. He says, human beings basically find happiness in nature happiness, social happiness, vocational happiness, physical happiness, intellectual happiness, and humor happiness. And then Randy Alcorn writes, the one remaining component available only to believers is spiritual happiness. Murray calls this a joy that at times contains more pleasure and delight than the other six put together. So, again, what we're inviting people to is to say, you're operating these little moments, snippets of happiness, but we're inviting you under the umbrella of full and complete happiness because it's under the authority and the reign and the goodness of God. I love this quote toward the end here. Let's see if I can find it, where he talks about, here it is, George MacDonald and his struggle with happiness. And then he says this, let me read this quote. One of the greatest difficulties in consenting to think of religion was that I thought I should have to give up my beautiful thoughts and my love for the things God has made. But I find that the happiness springing from all things not in themselves sinful is much increased by religion. God is the God of the beautiful, religion the love of the beautiful, and heaven the house of the beautiful. Nature is tenfold brighter in the sun of righteousness, and my love of nature is more intense since I became a Christian. God has not given me such thoughts and forbid me to enjoy them. Will he not in them enable me to raise the voice of praise? And that's like just a beautiful quote from McDonald saying, like, God doesn't squelch our happiness, he elevates our happiness. So I want to kind of lay that out there as a thought for you. When you think about sharing your faith with others, talking about faith with people, do you feel like you're inviting them to happiness or just to holiness? Are you inviting them to happiness or just forgiveness from sin? God invites us through our relationship with Jesus into a fullness of life, which is forgiveness of sin, joy, contentment, happiness, peace, all these different aspects. The other thing I want to ask you is, how has your relationship with God shaped your understanding of happiness? Do you feel like since you've come to God, you're happier, you're less happy? Happiness is squelched because of God. Happiness is elevated because of God. Think about those things. Those are some things we can consider this week as we wrestle with this question. Does God want us happy, first of all? And then what is the true source? How do we find that real happiness? How do we think about it? And again, this chapter title, where does true happiness begin? How do we find that true happiness? So there's some thoughts on this chapter. Again, chapter 8 and 9 is where we're going to go next week. So come back, join us, leave those comments in the comment section. And thanks for being part of our study of the book, Does God Want Us to Be Happy by Randy Alcorn. All right, we'll talk to you guys soon. Take care.